Welcome to the Game Design for Student Success webinar series. We are going to continue with the 7th of our 9-part series, and today's webinar will be on the 4 types of fun. I'm your presenter, Candace Best, and before we get into the heart of today's webinar, I will go over our housekeeping items that we do every week for those of you who may be watching for the first time. This webinar is recorded and will be available on replay within about an hour. As always, we invite those of you watching, if you are not already registered for our webinar series, to please do so that you can receive alerts when the next webinar is published, and also will be able to download any handouts that we may have related to the individual webinars. You are able to also post questions and comments on our broadcast page, which again is accessible via our webinar. That is where we will respond to questions and comments about the webinar content, both live and afterwards, asynchronously. So you can always come back and post a question at any point to that URL, and we will respond promptly. Live tweeting is encouraged using the GDSS hashtag, and Brooklyn Bingo refers to our broadcast location. If you are listening live, this only applies to those listening to the live version of this webinar, and you hear a horn or a siren or any other external noise that is associated with our location, if you type Brooklyn Bingo in the comment section on our broadcast page at the webinar URL, we will send you a $5 gift card. So with that, the learning objectives for today's webinar are to go over the 4 types of fun, the 4 types of fun model, so that you will be able to describe what the 4 types of fun are. We will then align those types of fun with the progression arc that you would no doubt be familiar with if you've participated in our earlier webinars in the series. If not, I encourage you to check out any of the series on the progression or any of our other series webinars on the different elements of game design, but we'll align it with that. Specifically related to progression, we will map the relationship between the types of fun and the game design for student success model. That is that progression arc that is part of our game design for student success framework. And then we'll wrap up by talking about what kind of strategy you can apply to incorporating these different types of fun into your educational goals, which is obviously the goal of the overall webinar series, to figure out how to apply the game design principles that we cover in each of these webinars to whatever your goals are, given your setting and background. So first, I need to acknowledge where the 4 types of fun model comes from. It is the creation of Nicole Lazzaro, who is a game design researcher. We actually talked a little bit about her and her work in our previous webinar on emotions, but the 4 types of fun is actually something that she's specifically known for, and has done a lot of research on how fun is not only integral to game design and what makes games sticky, which makes them attractive to players, but how games actually can be used to achieve specific ends. So to that end, before we go into the details of the different types of fun, I think it's important to just spend a moment talking about why do we need to focus on fun. This entire series has focused on learning about game design principles so that you could use them deliberately. But what's so special about games? To me, and often when I do this workshop, one of the first things I ask, one of the first exercises we do in the workshop version, is I ask participants to write down all of the words that come to mind when they think of a game or when they hear the word game. And invariably, the word that comes up most often is fun. We associate fun with games. But that's also the reason why there can sometimes be pushback, especially in higher education settings, when it comes to applying game design to higher education. This notion that fun, that school is not supposed to be fun at the college level, I think is misguided. But so this bulleted list speaks to some tangible reasons why fun is actually not only appropriate, but an important tool that if we're not deliberately incorporating it into our education goals, we're missing out on an opportunity. First, fun helps to overcome emotional constraints. And again, the notion of emotions and constraints was its own webinar in the series. So again, if you're just joining us for the first time, I would certainly encourage you to check out that particular webinar to learn more about what we mean by that. But we know that some of the things, especially at the higher ed level, some of the obstacles that can get in the way of persistence, for example, or success are emotional. They're constraints that students bring with them, a fear of math, a fear of not fitting in, you name it, frustration, anger. All of these experiences can get between the student and the subject matter that we as faculty are trying to help students to learn so that it benefits them. And making something fun helps to overcome those emotional constraints. In the process, it can demystify confusing content if it's framed in a certain way. This makes me think of our webinar on narrative and the role that narrative can play in providing a context that makes content more approachable. A great narrative should also be fun to experience, right? So there's a connection there. It can be a de-stressor. Again, if we bring levity to a difficult task, that reduces the stress associated with it. If you think back to our discussion on flow and our goal of advancing students through that flow model from apathy through interest and arousal into flow, fun helps to do that. Fun helps to keep a player, and in our instance, our players are our students, engaged enough so that they will stick with something that is potentially challenging. They'll stick with the challenge enough to develop proficiency so that they develop mastery. On the other end, fun is the antidote to boredom. Boredom is the other reason why on our flow model, students may disengage because something's too easy and they're not interested. If it's fun, they don't think about it as being boring, right? And you'll see in a second when we go over the 4 types of fun, how that would apply. And then finally, fun can create an anchor. You know, at the end of the day, we need our students to be connected enough to whatever it is we're asking them to do, whether it's a class, content, a course, or it's a programmatic activity. If we've designed it, presumably we've designed it and presented it to students because we believe it will benefit them. And sometimes those benefits are not immediate. You need the student to hang in there with you long enough for them to experience the benefits of it. And so anything that you can do to anchor a student into an experience long enough for them to benefit from it is a good thing, and fun does that really, really well. So let's go through the 4 types of fun. So this is what they are: easy fun, hard fun, people fun, and serious fun. According to Nicole Lazzaro's model, these are the 4 types of fun. We're going to go through each one of them one by one so that you can have a better understanding of what they are before we talk about how to use them. So the first type of fun is easy fun. I like to use this image of popping bubble wrap. It's a great illustration of what easy fun is. It's novel, it gets your attention, it's inherently engaging, so you don't have to explain it to someone, you don't have to persuade them. Easy fun is something that, like popping bubble wrap, you don't have to teach anybody how to do it. They see it once, they experience it once, they're immediately hooked. It's very soothing in that instance. But there's easy control, so the player can immediately take control of the experience. And perhaps most importantly, easy fun is characterized by having low barriers to entry. So again, it doesn't require onboarding. It doesn't require a lot of explaining or instruction or tutoring to figure out how to access that fun. It's just something you can jump right into and enjoy. So we can associate it with creativity, exploration, curiosity. These are all descriptors, adjectives, emotions in some respect that reflect something we can jump right into, and we don't need any assistance to do it. So easy fun, serves an important role. It can even be something that we just do for distraction, but there is value even in that. So that's our first type of fun. And I would say that that's probably where our mind defaults to when we think about fun in relation to games. We probably default to this. This is probably the standard way we think about fun. We think about fun in relation to what under this model would be called easy fun. But now you know that's only one of the types. The next type, and here's, I think, the type of fun that allows us to push back on those who say that a discussion of games and fun in higher education is not applicable or appropriate. This type of fun is directly related to perhaps our most challenging types of content and experiences. And in this model, it's called hard fun. Hard fun is characterized by the fact that it restricts and frustrates players. It is hard by definition. It involves challenges. It may involve strategy. All of the things that we know already exist, especially in higher ed. It's part of what we're trying to overcome. If you think back on our conversation about the role of constraints in game design, one of the things we want to do is, rather than avoid constraints or pretend that they're not there, game designers are deliberate about using constraints strategically. This is the corollary to that. It's identifying that when done right, it can be difficult and still be fun. That's what hard fun reminds us of. I would also say that hard fun is a predicate to mastery. If we're talking about mastering an important skill, a challenging skill, then that means at some point it's going to have to be difficult. At some point, you're going to have to move through something that's a little uncomfortable, or maybe a lot uncomfortable, that maybe you have to repeat a few times to get it right. So it's useful to have a way of saying that there is a form of this that is fun. The example that I use that's been relevant for me right now at this particular point that this is first being broadcast, I am in the midst of trying to prepare for a marathon. I don't have a long history as an athlete. I was not an athlete in high school. I am a woman of a certain age without disclosing what that age is, but it suffices to say that this is a challenge for me. Learning how to adjust my body and to train consistently and to go through the pain sometimes of running over long distances is hard, but it is, as I started to make progress in it, it has been very satisfying. So hard fun also should be recognized as something that has high barriers to entry. It is not the type of activity that most people can walk right in off the street and engage in without some difficulty. So again, it's important to know that there's a place for that. We know that those experiences exist in higher education, but hard fun is a way of acknowledging that that can still be fun. And the fun comes from accomplishing it, from conquering that thing that was challenging and that required strategy, that was frustrating, that was difficult, that we might have failed at. So clearly it requires persistence and grit. That's a whole topic unto itself. But we know that while persistence and grit are important ingredients to success, it's not always clear how you help your students develop it. If we think about it, however, in the context of it being a form of fun, then that may be a good first step towards that. So that's our second type of fun, hard fun. Our third type of fun is people fun. People fun is non-cognitive. That's what stands out, at least for me. It is the type of fun that has the highest emotional engagement. So according to Nicole Lazzaro's research, people fun generates more emotional investment and engagement than the other three forms of fun combined. That's really powerful. People fun by itself has more potential emotional content, engagement, and investment than the other three forms of fun combined. So people fun is an extremely potent tool. Not surprisingly, I'm a big fan of people fun because if you've been following our game design for student success model, integrates other people as an essential element to the model. So this reinforces why that is an important decision. One of the reasons why people fun is so potent is that it can create lifetime bonds. When people work together, when they have fun together, when they do things together, it creates a social bond that in and of itself can help achieve the objectives that you may have for game design. And whereas easy fun had low barriers to entry and hard fun has high barriers to entry, people fun can really mediate the barriers to entry. People fun is a great way of helping players make a transition from what is easy to what is hard. And you'll see in a second that I actually advise that as a deliberate and strategic tool when you're thinking about how to incorporate fun into your design. But finally, if we wanted to break down what the components of people fun are, these are 4 elements. It requires proximity, commonality, social investment, and trust. So I want to take a moment here to unpack each of those. So one way of looking at that is treating these as the building blocks of people fun. So in other words, if you are designing or you're applying a game design strategy, especially obviously if you're using the game design for student success framework, people fun is built into it. What are the building blocks to doing that? So when you're thinking about a loop where you're going to incorporate people fun into it, for example. So these are the 4 elements that you have to take into consideration. So let's walk through each of them. First is proximity. So designing for people fun means that you have to create opportunities for your players, your students in this instance, to interact and preferably to be interdependent. This should sound familiar because we covered that. We've talked about these same dynamics in earlier webinars on emotions and constraints and intrinsic motivation. We've talked about the importance of interdependence. So we're revisiting it again because it is an essential part of how you build people fun or build community into your game. First, they have to be the players have to have an opportunity to interact with each other at a minimum, but if you can design it so that there is some interdependence, even better. Second, you have to have commonality. What commonality means is something that they have in common. It may be something that they have in common before you bring them together, or you can create shared identities or some commonality as a part of the game design experience. So think about college and think about the mascot, right? I'm an alum of several schools. So if I think about my undergraduate, I attended St. John's University in New York. And back when I attended, they were still called the Red Men. They changed their name, I'm proud to say, so that it was no longer insulting and offensive to natives. And so now it's the Red Storm. But the identity associated to that is we're called Johnnies. I've run into people who went to St. John's who've said to me, "Oh, you're a Johnny." That's an example of a shared identity. I also am a alum of Villanova as of this year, 2018, when this is being published. They just won the national championship for the 2nd time in 3 years, I'm proud to say, of basketball. But in that instance, I have a shared identity with them, and then that makes me a Wildcat. Any college, all colleges have mascots. They create an identity around that. That's one example of a shared identity that bonds your students and graduates as alumni together. That's one example. But you can have commonality around context. You can have commonality around shared goals or shared outcomes. And so within your school, it could be the department or the major. It could be the program that the students belong to. It could be an honor society or just a service project. The point is, do not don't overlook being explicit about creating identities that your participants, your players, in this instance, your students, can connect to and thereby connect with each other through as a part of the experience that you're designing. So commonality is second. The third is social investment. So we're moving into deeper and deeper contexts or structures that can be designed that create the conditions for bonding that make people fun so impactful. In this instance, what social investment refers to are meaningful exchanges and mutual commitment. What does that mean? It means at some point, the interactions, you've given a group of people an opportunity to get to know each other. You've perhaps presented them with some shared context or identities that can serve to tie them together. And if you're handing them the identity, so for example, if you're not bringing people together because they all came from the same high school, that would be a pre-existing shared identity that they come with them. Let's use the example of freshmen coming to a university for the first time, and you've created a cohort of students, but now you're trying to get them to bond. They didn't know each other before. It could be that they're all in the same dorm. Whatever it is, that's a shared identity. That's a starting point. But at some point, for that relationship to go beyond the superficial, there has to be some investment that each of the participants makes. And what prompts social investment are, one, when there are exchanges of some sort. It could be exchanges of information, exchanges of goods. If we use game mechanics, the way that this is designed in games is that you give them an opportunity, they could share virtual goods. Exchanges can mean a number of things, but it's just that there is some sort of reciprocity that's happening. And then also mutual commitment means that if I'm going to make an investment, even if it's just an investment of my time, then if I see other people in this group also making an investment, that in and of itself bonds us together. Conversely, if I make an investment and someone else doesn't, that's going to create greater distance. So the point is, if you think about any of the relationships that you've had, friendships that you've had, whether they've been long-term friendships or short working relationships, a bond that forms just over the course of a group project, typically the quality of that relationship is going to turn on, in part, the investment that's made. So in a group project, for instance, for class, did everybody do the same amount of work? One of the reasons why many students don't like group projects is that you may end up on a team where everybody's not carrying their weight, and some students are doing more and some students are doing less. And part of that frustration comes from the fact that there's a lack of mutuality of commitment in those examples. But the fact that that is frustrating indicates how important social investment is. So thinking about how you can create not only environments where those opportunities exist, but to the extent that you can, encourage or prompt the exchange of something meaningful and an opportunity to demonstrate, gradually increasing levels of commitment by the participants. Where that happens well, you have social investment, and you have the third element of people fun. And the fourth is trust. Now, actually, they each flow from each other. I've listed them as discrete elements, but if you really think about it, one builds on the other. Trust is really the culmination of the other three elements being in place. If I've had the opportunity to interact with you enough to start to get to know you, if I realize we have something in common, either pre-existing or we've built a shared identity through our experience, and then we've had some meaningful exchanges with each other, you've made commitments, I've made commitments, the small group, whether it's 2 people or 5 people, are all making investments for the benefit of whatever the shared context or goal or outcome is in this group. And we're doing it consistently. What that does is create conditions for members to trust one another. Disclosures can be a form of meaningful exchange. In other words, one of the ways that trust is built is by each party disclosing something that's important. The disclosure should be small and not terribly personal in the beginning when you're just getting to know someone. But if you think about how friendships form and how friendships deepen, usually you start with very minor disclosures like, this is where I'm from, this is what I like, these are the sports teams I'm into, whatever, this is my favorite color. Those are low risk disclosures. But within the interactions you have with people, if you have a small group of people that you come to like, that you come to enjoy being around, that you've come to, again, have exchanges and activities with, you may over time start to disclose more. And in fact, you really expect to disclose more and those individuals to disclose more to you. It's really almost a requirement or an expectation of deepening bonds. We're going to talk more about this. In fact, the next webinar is going to be all about this when we talk about Dunbar clusters. So I'm going to just leave it here to say these are the 4 elements that you want to think about when you're deliberately designing an experience. And of course, our smallest unit of analysis are a loop. So I want to talk in terms of loops. So when you're designing a loop as a part of your game design strategy, and you're thinking about a loop that should reflect people fun, then you want to use this almost as a checklist of what you need to think about. How are you making sure that each of these elements of people fun are present? So the final type of fun is serious fun. And I always think of the Peace Corps as a perfect example of that. It's a little bit challenging, not a little bit. I had an opportunity a few years ago to actually interview a returning Peace Corps volunteer. That's what they call themselves when they've finished their term of service. And it was a wonderful interview where this Peace Corps volunteer talked about how it changed their life being a part of it, that it was hard, but what makes the Peace Corps and being a returning Peace Corps volunteer so meaningful is that you're making a difference. And that's really what separates serious fun, let's say, from hard fun. They certainly work hard in the Peace Corps, but that's not what they remember most. They remember most a sense of accomplishment, that they were engaged in work that was purposeful, that had meaning. In education in particular, if we have students, and in fact, I've said this before, I may have even said this at one of the earlier webinars. I know I say this every chance I get, and certainly to my students all the time. If you have gone through an educational experience, whether it's your entire college career or even down to an individual class, if you can't see how you change as a person at the end of that college course, when compared to who you were in the beginning, then you've wasted your time and money. I believe, and it's just my opinion, but I feel very strongly standing in it, that that's what distinguishes college from other forms of education. It is supposed to be a meaningful experience. As educators, we should hold ourselves to the standard of making sure that students don't just learn content, but that they see that there was some meaning, some sense of purpose in what they were exposed to during the 10, 12, 14, or even if it was 5 weeks, whatever the length of this college course was, that beyond just knowing something more than they knew before about a topic, that they had some sort of meaningful growth or some level of transformation in who they were as a person. To the extent that that happens, then that's serious fun. That's a form of serious fun, because this activity that you've had them engaging with also carried something meaningful for them that will stay with them after they finish. In so doing, my argument is that serious fun actually supersedes barriers to entry. And by that, I mean, depending on what you have them doing, there's some types of serious fun that can be a lot of hard work, a huge commitment, like the Peace Corps. There's some types of serious fun. I would associate serious fun, for example, with charity work, service learning, if we keep it within the education context. You might be engaged in a project that's only going to be 3 hours once over the course of the semester. That's not terribly hard work. So let's say your service learning, you're going and you're reading to small children at a homeless shelter or something. It's not terribly hard to do. That might not have a high barrier to entry. But whatever the effort is superseded by the meaning you got out of it. So whether it's something like just 3 hours of volunteering your time at a nursing home or at a shelter, or it's something as extraordinarily, challenging and difficult as dedicating 6 months or a year in some foreign country and as a member of the Peace Corps, which is very hard and may have high barriers to entry because of the application process and the interview process and then the training. There's a lot involved in it. So it has high barriers to entry. But again, as the individual I interviewed indicated, that is not what they remember when they finish. They don't remember how hard it was. I mean, they remember how hard it was. She was able to talk about it. But what was superseding that difficulty, those challenges, was the sense of meaning. And that is why serious fun supersedes whatever the barriers to entry are. And that is what makes it such a potent type of fun and an important type of fun that should be deliberately incorporated into what you're planning, especially over the course of, it may not be at the end of every arc. Ideally, it would be. And you'll see in a second when I map it out to our game design model. But certainly over the course of something significant at a transition point, you want to make sure that there's a check-in, that there's some way that what you're planning to do can reflect serious fun, can reflect meaning. It changes the player and it changes the player's view of the world. So that goes back to what I said earlier. Have you thought, whether you're a faculty member planning a syllabus or you're a program director organizing a program, have you thought about how your students will see the world differently as a result of going through that experience? That is a reasonable, I think, expectation for whatever it is we're planning to do in higher ed. I would go so far as to say it's a prerequisite. It should be part of the requirements, just like any other learning objective. Have we been able to convey why this was important, why this was meaningful to, or should it be seen as meaningful? So serious fun encapsulates that as a form of fun and a way of looking at it as we plan for that. So here's how this would map out on our game design for student success model, our progression arc. So starting with discovery. So if we look at this and we think about this again, also with our flow diagram where we said the lower left-hand corner, all your participants are starting from a place of apathy, assuming that they start from a place of apathy, meaning they don't know what they're doing or why they need to do it. So you first need to recruit them in. That's why our first stage is discovery. They have to discover what you're asking them to do and make the decision that it's worth pursuing. That's why it has to start with easy fun, right? There can't be any barriers to entry when you're first trying to bring someone on into that experience. And so easy fun, how can you make it something that meets the requirements for easy fun to get them started and then move them into the next phases? The next phase you'll see, and here again is I will underscore what I've said several times about what makes the game design for student success framework, our model, distinct from other types of game design models. It is built with the intention that interaction between students, people, or using today's lingo, people fun, is integral to it. And you will see two things here. I have people fun spanning first contact and onboarding. In fact, the symbol for first contact in this visual, this graphic, is two people, right? So first contact under this model always assumes that we're talking about contact with people. So if you're using chatbots or you're using I love technology, don't get me wrong, I'm not opposed to it. I think it should be used as an enabler, but especially if we're talking about trying to reach students that we're particularly concerned about being at risk for not persisting or are not being able to retain them, we need to build in. You can augment with technology, but your plan needs to be designed around how human interaction is going to be part of that first contact. And think of it in terms of our requirements for people fun, because the goal is for that first contact to transition that student or your students through onboarding into habit building. So people fun becomes important in both of those phases, because the onboarding is part of what they're learning how to do, and they're also learning about why it's important to do it. And remember, we talked about fun being part of how we create anchors. This becomes a critical part of the anchor. This is the beginning of your anchoring process. Prior to this, the easy fun, if you've ever played a game that was easy and fun, but wasn't much more than that, at some point you stop and you may not come back, right? We enjoy popping bubble wrap, but we don't do it forever. At some point we stop and do other things. So you've got to move. Your goal is always to move your students, move that player through. And so that people fun is that critical transition element, because what's coming next is hard, right? So it's the work that it takes to build a habit is repetitive. It's usually going to take the most time. And depending on what it is you're asking the student to do, it may be the place where there's going to be the most frustration. And in fact, we anticipated that's what hard fun is. We know it restricts and it frustrates, and it can sometimes confound. It's challenging. So you'll notice in this, we're talking about two different types of fun that your student/player encounters before we hit them with what's hard. This is what we don't necessarily do well. This is where I think the biggest opportunity exists in thinking about what we want to accomplish through a game design lens. It's being deliberate in recognizing we know we can't avoid challenging. We can't make a meaningful degree program all easy. What this is saying is it doesn't have to be easy. Just think about when the hard part is presented. And did we ramp up and provide enough of a ramp up to the hard fun so that by the time the student experiences it, they are better prepared for it or put in the best position to support sticking with it. And then at the end, as I said previously, then through that hard fun, having overcome those challenges, having persisted through to mastery, that is when we expect that they'll look back and see that there was a sense of meaning and purpose to the work that they've done. And that's where serious fun is. So in this model, this is how the four types of fun, at least conceptually, should be organized. And I said this before, but before I leave this slide, I think it bears repeating. If we have not figured out how to convey meaning in the experience that we put our students through, so in other words, if we haven't organized our experience such that serious fun is what's waiting at the end, that is this ability to look back and see how what they experienced was meaningful, then not only have we failed the students, but this is how we set ourselves up as institutions, as higher educators, for students to be frustrated and angry and feel like they didn't get their money's worth through their learning experience. And let's face it, I have encountered students who are like, I don't even know why I went to college, or who dropped out because they didn't think, a student who dropped out because they didn't think they were getting anything meaningful. That may just be that may be due to, a poor design. So again, from a game design perspective, the hard fun came too early. There was no easy fun. It was sort of, it was happenstance. And we talked more about that in the progression and flow webinars earlier. We know that there are improvements we can make to the design that are intentionally designed to get the student to stick with it long enough to get through. What I'm talking about here is the student who actually did get through. who finished their degree program, who graduated and look back. And I've had these conversations periodically with people who've said, yeah, I don't even know why I went. I didn't get anything out of it. Well, then that is a missed opportunity. That is a student for whom there was nothing that was presented to them that helped them to see that there was some meaning and purpose to that experience. And on that, the school has to take some responsibility, or the degree program has to take some responsibility. When I do podcasts, I just finished an interview for our latest podcast that'll be coming out next week. And I try to make a point. In fact, in all of our Genius Cafe podcasts, I always start when I do an interview by asking my guest to talk about their educational journey and what they got out of it and what their experiences were. And what I wanted to get out of that experience is, one of the questions I asked recently was, when you talk about something that you got out of it, did you see that benefit immediately, or did it take some time for you to recognize it? Sometimes that happens. Sometimes you don't see the benefit of what you experienced until you're away from it for a while. And then you look back and go, oh, wow, I really got a lot out of it. So that can happen. But we as educators can certainly be more deliberate about making the purpose and meaning explicit up front. I know that the last time I was teaching at the undergrad level, when I got letters from students or had students, reach out to me afterwards to say that they really got something out of the class, often it was because I took the time to make explicit either at the beginning of the class or at the end of class why we were doing what we were doing, why I was not only presenting them with the content. The content was probably designed by the curriculum committee. You must cover these subjects. But in college, as college professors, we do tend to have a lot of leeway about how we present it. So I always wanted to make clear, we're going to do these things in this way because this is what I want you to get out of it. These are my classroom policies as a faculty member, but this is why, because this is how I want this to help you grow. And just having those conversations with a student, it may just be in the first 15 minutes of the first class when you're establishing what the policies are going to be for your class. Those are the opportunities for you to plant a seed about why what's being asked matters. And I've just found in my experience as an educator that that's made a difference. What I would say here is, and when we're talking about fun, this is the context in which that actually can have a purpose and have real value. Easy fun, people fun, hard fun, serious fun. So to wrap up, so this particular webinar is going to be a little bit shorter than some of our others, which is not a bad thing. These are your takeaways. Always start with easy fun. Easy fun comes first. You want to have the lowest barrier to entry be the first thing that your player/student experiences. Make space for social bonding. In some areas where this may be something you're considering in terms of game design, that may be easier, certainly at the programmatic level. Thinking about a program and how you can make it social probably comes naturally, but what about in a course? Right? Just making a group project doesn't necessarily make it fun. As I've mentioned earlier, some students hate group projects because they actually think it's not going to be fun. So just throwing a bunch of students together is not enough. If you want to create social bonding opportunities, you need to think deliberately about all four of those elements that I covered earlier in the webinar, and that I will revisit again in the next webinar that we do. We'll talk a little bit more about it, but you can incorporate it into the class, but you want to think beyond just, here's an assignment you have to do with other people. Think about how you've constructed the points, how you've constructed the rewards, how you've even just presented the assignment so that it makes space for not just working together, but bonding socially. Reframe challenges. So if you know you have a hard subject matter, if you're in what we call those high DFW classes, courses that students withdraw from or fail at a high rate. So there's no getting around it. It's hard. You can't make it easy. As we've identified hopefully in this webinar, that's not the objective of game design, is to make something hard easy, but you can make something hard fun. And one of the ways you can do that is by reframing the challenge as a game. How can you present this as a game, as a series of challenges that you're stringing together? The hint is follow our model, break it down into loops. You can use mechanics, and again, that's what the previous webinars were for. So, I would invite you to check out the earlier webinars to learn more about the logistics or the tactics that you can use. But that's the whole point of this webinar series. But at a minimum, now you can see that you frame them intentionally. You can be explicit about it and framing it as a game so that that challenge is experienced as fun, because it can be. fun. Even difficult, it can be made fun. Use people fun as a mediator. The more hard fun your objective is going to involve, the more important it is for you to incorporate people fun as a part of that. So if there was a way that you can insert people fun into that process, it will make your objectives easier to achieve, because you are, as they say, a burden shared is a burden halved. If you can distribute the pain, you distribute the gain. So use people fun as a mediator when you know hard fun is going to be a big part of your objective or your solution or your experience that you're designing. And then give frustration meaning. Give the experience, not just frustration, but give the entire context of what you're asking your students to do meaning. We talked a little bit about that in the last webinar on narrative, that's the role that narrative can play, but you have to, before you can write the narrative, you have to think in terms of what is the meaning that you're hoping for students to convey. And if frustration is going to be a part of it, here's where serious and fun and hard fun can very often overlap. Then you can do yourself a favor and you can do your students a favor by at least providing some meaningful context or helping make explicit the meaning that is associated with it. You're going through this pain for a reason. This is how it's going to benefit you on the other end. Having those conversations, but again, being meaningful, meaning pointing to something that's bigger than the immediate, right? Bigger than, do this and then you'll get an A, but framing it in terms of a broader growth, whether it's internal growth, whether it's their ability to make a contribution to the larger society. Again, it's going to be relative to whatever it is you're trying to achieve or whatever your course is. But if you believe that higher education is a meaningful endeavor, I certainly do. I hope anyone listening to this or participating in this webinar shares that view. So if you do, then this shouldn't be difficult to do. All I'm saying with this recommendation is that you're being explicit about making sure that that meaning is conveyed clearly to your students, because it's not always obvious to them. It may be obvious to us that we take it as second nature, but it's not always obvious to them. So as always, I would encourage you to post any questions or comments that you have either now or at any point, at whatever point you may be coming in contact with this webinar and this information. If you have a question or a comment and you're ready to dive in and try some of these principles, please post them to our the comments on our broadcast page. If you happen to have found this on YouTube, we'll make sure we include a link so you can get to the broadcast page, because I can't guarantee that we'll be able to respond to all the comments on YouTube, but we will absolutely respond to every question and every comment that you post at our site as a part of this series webpage. So we're coming to the end of the series. The next webinar that we will have and released will be on Dunbar clusters. So as I mentioned earlier, this is actually our opportunity to drill down even further on people fun, because Dunbar clusters, if you've never heard of the Dunbar number, that's what this is related to. Or if you have heard of the Dunbar number, then that's what this is related to. But if you haven't, you're in for a treat. So I would absolutely invite you to make sure you join us for the next webinar, because all of this relates to the power of people fun, but in a much more specific and targeted way. And that will be our second to last webinar. And then we'll wrap everything up the week after that with Learn Nurturing. So that's the end of this webinar. Again, please post any comments and questions that you have. We'd love to hear them, hear from you. Other than that, I hope to have you as a participant in our next webinar. And thank you for listening to this webinar.